My name is Derek Fisher, and for 31 years I dug graves at Greenwood Cemetery in Reading, Pennsylvania. I started this work back in 1994, fresh out of high school, and I stayed with it through 3 decades because it was honest work that paid well and let me be outdoors. I learned the trade from my father, who'd worked the same grounds for 20 years before me. He taught me that digging a grave wasn't just making a hole in the ground, it was precision work. It required respect for the deceased and their families. It demanded skill that most people never see or appreciate. Until last month, I would have told you I'd seen everything. Bodies that had been in the ground 50 years and looked like they'd been buried last week. Caskets that crumbled apart when we moved them. Ground so frozen in winter, we had to wait for a thaw just to break the surface. Families who changed burial plans at the last minute and made us scramble. Equipment failures, flooding, tree roots that grew right through concrete vaults. Strange smells. Unusual discoveries. I handled it all without batting an eye because that was the job. But something happened in October that I still can't explain. Something that made me walk away from the only career I'd ever known. And I'm telling you this story because I need someone else to know what's buried under Greenwood Cemetery. Not just bodies, something else. Something impossible that shouldn't exist but does. Let me start by explaining what my job actually involved, because most folks don't really understand. When someone dies and their family chooses burial, the cemetery office sends us a work order with all the details. Name of the deceased, date of service, location of the plot. We use that information to prepare the gravesite, which means a lot more than just digging a hole. Every grave has to be exactly 8 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. That's the standard size to fit a casket inside a concrete burial vault. The vault is a big concrete box that goes in the ground first, then the casket gets lowered into it during the funeral. The vault protects the casket from the weight of all that soil. Without it, the ground would eventually crush down and collapse the casket over time. Some states require vaults by law. Pennsylvania doesn't, but most cemeteries, including Greenwood, insist on them anyway because they prevent the ground from sinking and creating uneven terrain. We use a backhoe for most of the digging, a Kubota model that I'd operated for years and knew like the back of my hand. But the last 1.5 feet always gets done by hand with shovels. That's to make sure we don't accidentally hit water lines or damage nearby graves. We take measurements constantly. We photograph everything for our records. We level the bottom perfectly flat so the vault sits stable. It's detailed work that takes concentration and experience. Greenwood Cemetery covers 63 acres on the eastern edge of Reading. It was established back in 1872, which makes it one of the older cemeteries in Berks County. The oldest section has graves dating back to the Civil War era, with those old-style headstones that are so weathered you can barely read the names anymore. The newer sections have modern granite markers, some with photographs etched right into the stone. We keep the grounds maintained beautifully. Mowed lawns, trimmed hedges, flower beds near the entrance. People come there not just for funerals, but to visit family, to walk the paths, to find some peace and quiet. I knew every section of that cemetery like I knew my own neighborhood. Section A through Section M, each one divided into blocks and lots with a numbering system that made sense once you understood it. I could walk you to any grave without needing a map. After 31 years, the layout was burned into my memory. On October 24th of this year, I showed up for work at 6:30 in the morning, like always. 2 funerals scheduled for that day. I'd already dug the first grave the day before, so I just needed to prepare one more. The work order said Section F, Block 12, Lot 78. A woman named Dorothy Kaufman, age 81, passed away on October 21st. Standard burial with a concrete vault. Her family had chosen a plot on a slight hill with a view of the main avenue that runs through the cemetery. I drove the backhoe over to the location, set up my stakes and string to mark the boundaries, and started removing the topsoil. The ground felt normal. We've got mostly clay soil in Section F, which can be heavy and sticky when it's wet, but wasn't too bad that morning since we'd had dry weather for about a week. By 8 o'clock, I was down about 3 feet and everything seemed routine. That's when Marcus Bowen, our cemetery superintendent, came walking over with a clipboard in his hand and a concerned look on his face. "Derek, we've got a situation with the Kaufman burial," he said. "Family just called with a change." I shut off the backhoe and climbed down. What kind of change? Husband died last night. Heart attack. They want to bury them together. This happened from time to time. Not often, but often enough that we had procedures for it. Instead of a single vault, we'd need to install what's called a companion vault. It's wider, designed to hold two caskets side by side. The grave dimensions change from 3.5 feet wide to 5.5 feet wide. Everything else stays the same. I'll need to widen it out, I told Marcus. Probably adds a couple hours to the job. Family's paying the difference. Both services are this afternoon now, 2:30 and 3 o'clock. I spent the rest of the morning carefully expanding that grave, measuring over and over to make sure I had it right. A companion vault is bigger and heavier than a standard vault, so the excavation has to be precise, or you run into problems during the lowering. By 11:30, I had a grave measuring 8 feet long, 5.5 feet wide, and exactly 6 feet deep. I took photographs, like I always did, wrote down the measurements in our logbook, and set up the lowering device that we'd use during the service. I walked back to the equipment shed to put away my tools and grab lunch from my truck. When I came back past the Kaufman grave about 20 minutes later, something looked off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The grave just looked narrower than I remembered. Not by much, just slightly off. I pulled out my tape measure and checked the width. 5.5 feet exactly, same as before. I checked the length, 8 feet. Also correct. The depth measured 6 feet even. All the numbers matched what I'd recorded in the logbook, but it looked narrower. I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd been staring at that hole for 5 hours straight. The angle of the sun was different now around noon compared to the morning. Shadows can change how things appear. I was probably just tired. I went back to my truck, ate my sandwich, and didn't think much more about it. Around 2 o'clock, our grounds crew started setting up chairs and a canopy tent for the funeral services. I positioned the lowering straps over the grave and made sure everything was ready. The funeral procession arrived right on schedule. 2 hearses pulled up, one behind the other. 2 caskets. The companion vault had been delivered that morning and sat on a rolling cart nearby. The services were quick, maybe 15 or 20 minutes each. A lot of families keep things brief when they are doing 2 burials back to back. By 3:30, the mourners had left, and it was time for us to handle the actual burial. That's when we do the real work that most people don't see. I had 2 guys helping me that day, Sawyer Mitchell and Tristan Holt, both good workers who'd been with the cemetery for several years. We positioned the companion vault over the grave opening using the lowering device, which is basically a sturdy frame with hydraulic controls that lets us lower heavy vaults without dropping them. "Derek, this looks tight," Sawyer said, peering down at the grave. "You sure the measurements are right for a companion vault?" I double-checked the work order on my clipboard. Companion vault needs 5.5 feet width. That's what I dug. We started lowering the vault slowly. The thing weighs close to 4,000 pounds, so you have to be careful and keep it level. As it descended, I noticed the space between the vault edges and the grave walls looked much tighter than it should have been. Normally, with a properly dug grave, you've got 3 or 4 inches of clearance on each side. This looked like maybe an inch at most. "Hold on," I called out, stopping the lowering with the vault suspended about 2 feet above the bottom. "Something's not right here." I grabbed my tape measure and climbed down into the grave to check the width again. When I stretched the tape across, it showed 4 feet 9 inches. I measured it 3 more times, thinking I'd made a mistake. Same result every time, 4 feet 9 inches wide. The grave had somehow gotten 8 inches narrower since I'd measured it at 11:30 that morning. That made no sense whatsoever. Soil doesn't just compress inward like that on its own. Even with clay soil that can shift and settle, you'd see cracks or bulging or some kind of visible change. These walls looked exactly as I'd left them, smooth and vertical and cleanly cut. "Sawyer, let me use your tape," I said, convinced mine was broken. His tape showed the same measurement, 4 feet 9 inches. "That can't be right," Tristan said from up above. "You dug this to 5.5 feet this morning. I saw you measuring it multiple times." I climbed out and pulled out my phone to look at the photographs I'd taken at 11:30. Clear pictures showing the completed grave with my tape measure stretched across displaying 5.5 feet. I showed the photos to Sawyer and Tristan. Look at these pictures and then look at this grave, I said. Same location, same grave, different width. The three of us stood there staring at that excavation, trying to make sense of it. Between us, we had over 40 years of combined experience digging graves. We'd prepared thousands of burial sites. We understood soil mechanics, proper excavation technique, how ground settles and shifts. None of that knowledge explained what we were looking at. I think we need to get Marcus, Tristan said quietly. Marcus arrived 15 minutes later with two people from the cemetery office, Stella Briggs and Jordan Pierce, who handled plot records and surveying. They brought measuring equipment and a laptop with our cemetery database that had maps and records for every grave at Greenwood going back decades. Stella set up a laser measuring tool, the kind contractors use that gives you precise digital readings. 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide, she announced after taking readings from multiple angles. 8 feet long, 5 feet 11 inches deep. The grave had shrunk again, another ½ inch narrower, and an inch shallower than my original 6-foot depth. Jordan checked the database on his laptop. This location shows no previous burials. Soil report from 2006 indicates stable clay and loam mix. No sinkholes or compression issues recorded anywhere in Section F. Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him in all my years at Greenwood. He looked genuinely frightened. Derek, you've been doing this work for 3 decades. Have you ever seen soil behave like this? Never, I said flatly. And I don't think this is the soil doing anything. Look around the grave. The ground surface is completely level. All that dirt I excavated is still piled right over there in the same amount. If these walls had collapsed inward, we'd see the dirt bulging somewhere or cracks forming. We'd see some kind of change. But the walls look perfect. They look exactly like I left them. We spent the next 2 hours running every test we could think of. The laser measurements kept showing the grave getting smaller, losing maybe a quarter inch of width every 20 minutes or so. The walls maintained their clean vertical lines. The bottom stayed flat and level. By every measure we knew how to take, this was a professionally excavated grave in stable soil, except it kept shrinking. By 5:30, as the sun started getting low, Stella's laser showed 4 feet 6 inches wide and 5 feet 9 inches deep. We'd lost over a foot of width and 3 inches of depth in about 6 hours, and we couldn't identify any reason for it. We can't put the vault in, Marcus said finally. It won't fit. We're going to have to dig a new grave. Where? I asked. Right next to this one? What if the same thing happens? Nobody had an answer. We moved the companion vault to our maintenance building for overnight storage and set up safety barriers around the Kaufman grave with temporary lighting so nobody would accidentally fall in. But honestly, I think we all wanted to keep an eye on it, to see what would happen overnight. I went home that evening and couldn't stop thinking about those measurements, about watching that laser reading decrease while we stood there, about the complete absence of any explanation that made sense. Around 11:30 at night, I got in my truck and drove back to Greenwood. I had keys to the front gate. After 31 years, I could come and go whenever I needed to. The Kaufman grave sat under the temporary lights exactly where we'd left it. I walked over slowly, tape measure in hand, feeling foolish but also deeply uneasy. I measured the width, 3 feet 11 inches. The grave had lost another 7 inches in about 6 hours. I measured the depth, 5 feet 5 inches, 4 more inches gone. I sat down on the grass next to that impossible excavation and tried to understand what I was witnessing. In roughly 14 hours, this grave had gone from 5.5 feet wide and 6 feet deep to 3 feet 11 inches wide and 5 feet 5 inches deep, over a 1.5 feet narrower, 7 inches shallower, with no displacement, no collapse, no disturbance of any kind visible. The grave was simply becoming smaller, as if the earth itself was slowly closing around the empty space. I stayed there measuring every hour through the night. By 5 in the morning, when the sky started turning gray with dawn, the grave measured 3 feet 4 inches wide and 5 feet 1 inch deep. It had become so narrow that a standard casket would barely fit, let alone the companion vault meant for 2. Marcus showed up at 6:30 with Stella, Jordan, Sawyer, and Tristan. We all stood around the grave in silence, looking at what had become of my excavation. I measured it every hour through the night, I told them. It's been shrinking steadily, about 5 or 6 inches of width and maybe half an inch of depth per hour. That's impossible, Jordan said, but he didn't sound like he believed his own words. I took pictures every time, I said, showing them my phone. 7 measurements between 11:30 last night and 5:30 this morning, all documented with time stamps. Stella set up her laser equipment again. 3 feet 3.5 inches wide, 5 feet even depth. She looked at Marcus. It's still shrinking, maybe even a little faster now. That's when Marcus made phone calls, first to the cemetery director, then to engineers from the county, then to a geology professor at Albright College here in Reading. Over the course of that morning, we had a dozen people come out to examine the grave. Everyone ran tests. Everyone took measurements. Everyone watched as the excavation continued getting smaller, hour by hour. By noon, it measured 2 feet 11 inches wide and 4 feet 9 inches deep. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 feet 7 inches wide and 4 feet 6 inches deep. The grave I'd spent hours preparing to exact specifications had become a narrow trench barely wide enough for a person to squeeze into. Then at 3:47 that afternoon, something changed. I was standing with Stella about 10 feet from the grave, looking at her laptop screen showing the latest laser scan, when the ground beneath us shuddered. Not like an earthquake, more subtle than that, like a settling, like something had shifted deep underground and the surface had responded. "Did you feel that?" Stella asked. We walked over to the grave together. I looked down into the excavation and felt something in my mind refuse to accept what I was seeing. The grave had stopped shrinking, but the bottom had changed. The soil at the bottom of the grave, which should have been solid packed clay, now looked different. It was dark and smooth and seemed to reflect the afternoon light in a way that dirt doesn't. It looked almost wet, but not quite. More like dark glass or still water. I picked up a small rock from the pile of excavated soil and dropped it into the grave. The rock fell normally until it hit the bottom, where it didn't stop. It passed right through that dark, smooth surface without making a sound, without a splash, without any resistance at all. It just kept falling. We watched it disappear into depth that shouldn't have existed. "What was that?" Stella whispered. I didn't have an answer. Neither did anyone else who came to look over the next few hours as word spread. The grave no longer looked like a grave. It looked like a window, an opening, a doorway into something that existed beneath Greenwood Cemetery, but shouldn't have been possible according to everything we understood about the world. Marcus called the Reading Police Department. They arrived around 5 o'clock with Detective Shane Barrett and 2 patrol officers. Barrett looked into the grave, listened to our timeline, reviewed all the photographs and measurements from the past day and a half, and then called the state police. By 7 that evening, we had representatives from Pennsylvania Emergency Management on site. By 9, they'd contacted the United States Geological Survey. By midnight, federal investigators from agencies I'd never heard of had established a security perimeter around the grave and were asking questions nobody could answer. The grave, measuring about 2.5 feet wide at the surface and impossibly deep at the bottom, stayed that way. That dark glass-like surface never changed, never moved. It just remained there like a window into nothing. They tested everything imaginable over the next 3 days. They lowered cameras into the grave on long cables. The video feeds showed the cameras descending through normal soil for about 4 feet, then passing through that dark surface into blackness so complete that their lights couldn't penetrate more than a few inches. They lowered cameras on 300 feet of cable. The cameras never found a bottom. The cables just kept going down and down into darkness that had no end. They tested the soil all around the grave. Normal clay and loam, same as the rest of Section F. They tested the air above the grave. Normal atmospheric mix of nitrogen and oxygen. They brought in equipment I didn't understand that measured things I'd never heard of. Everything registered as completely normal except for the grave itself, which had somehow transformed into a passage to nowhere. On the 4th day, I got called into Marcus's office. Stella and Jordan were already there, along with Detective Barrett and a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Victoria Lowe from the United States Geological Survey. "Derek, we've been going through cemetery records," Dr. Lowe said, pulling up files on Marcus's computer. "How many graves have you dug at Greenwood over the years?" Somewhere between 13 and 1400, I said. I'd have to check our records for an exact count. We need you to help us identify where each one is located. We spent the next 8 days going through records and walking the cemetery grounds. The database helped for graves from the past 15 years when we'd computerized everything. For older graves, I had to rely on memory and the old paper logbooks we kept in storage. By the end of that week, we'd identified 1,372 graves I'd personally dug during my 31 years at Greenwood. Then they brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment and spent another full week scanning those specific locations. They found 9 more. 9 other graves I'd excavated over the years that showed the same thing on the radar. That same dark, bottomless opening 6 feet down. They'd been hidden under grass and headstones for years, completely invisible from the surface. But the radar readings showed them clearly. 9 windows into darkness, scattered throughout Greenwood Cemetery, all of them perfectly stable, all of them completely undetectable without specialized equipment. The Kaufman grave is the only one where we witnessed the transformation, Dr. Lowe explained during a meeting in mid-November. The others appear to have opened at some point after you finished digging them. We believe you simply never saw it happen because you'd already moved on to other work. The graves got covered as normal during the burial services, and nobody had any reason to look underneath afterward. Why didn't anyone notice something was wrong? I asked. 9 graves over 30 years. Maintenance crews, visitors, groundskeepers. How did nobody see anything unusual? Because everything appeared normal from the surface, Marcus said quietly. Vaults got placed, caskets got lowered, soil got backfilled. The funerals all proceeded normally. Whatever is at the bottom of those graves, it's 6 feet underground beneath concrete vaults that weigh thousands of pounds. There was never any reason to dig them back up. Until now, Detective Barrett added, we're working with the district attorney to get court orders for exhumations. All 9 graves. The families need to be notified. This is going to be difficult. I left that meeting and drove home through Reading, feeling like I was living in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. 9 graves, 9 doorways into something impossible, and I'd created every single one without knowing what I was doing. The exhumation started 3 weeks later. I wasn't part of the work crew. I couldn't be. I'd taken what everyone understood was permanent leave from my job, but I got updates from Sawyer and Tristan, who watched as specialized teams carefully removed the soil, lifted the heavy vaults, and exposed what lay beneath. Every single casket had fallen through that dark surface into the emptiness below. The concrete vaults remained in place, solid shells surrounding nothing. The caskets and the people buried inside them were simply gone, dropped through that impossible threshold into whatever existed beneath Greenwood Cemetery. 9 graves, 17 people, all missing, all fallen into darkness that I'd unknowingly opened while doing what I thought was honest, skilled work. The families received notification in early December. The news coverage was extensive but carefully managed. Official statements mentioned unprecedented geological phenomena and ongoing federal investigation. They never explained about the bottomless graves or the missing remains. How could they? How do you tell people that their loved ones fell through the earth into nothing? I stopped going to Greenwood after that. Couldn't bring myself to drive past it. Marcus called a few times to check on me, but we both knew I wasn't coming back. 31 years of work, 31 years of believing I understood what I was doing when I opened the earth to make room for the dead. But I never understood. Not really. Most of the time I was just digging graves like I'd been taught. But sometimes, for reasons nobody has figured out, I was creating doorways to somewhere else. And I'll never know why some graves became passages when others didn't. I think about Dorothy Kaufman and her husband. They ended up buried in a different cemetery after their family paid for plots they believed would be their final resting place together. I think about the 9 other families whose loved ones vanished into darkness while I collected my paycheck and took pride in my work. Greenwood Cemetery is still operating. They hired new groundskeepers. They scan every location before digging now with radar and other equipment. They've established new protocols and safety procedures. They monitor those 10 known openings constantly with technology I don't fully understand. But I think about all the graves I dug before they had that technology. The hundreds of excavations from my early years at Greenwood, back in the 90s and early 2000s. before we kept detailed digital records of everything. How many other doorways did I create? How many other families have loved ones missing beneath headstones that mark nothing but empty vaults? Last week I drove past Greenwood late one evening just to see the place one more time. Security lights illuminated the newer sections. The older areas with their weathered Civil War-era stones remained dark under bare November trees. And I wondered how many graves in those older sections held the same secret. How many spaces I'd opened over 31 years had become passages to somewhere I'll never understand. I don't dig graves anymore. I don't work with soil or earth or the buried spaces we make for our dead. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel that shudder in the ground, that settling sensation that happened right before the Kaufman grave changed into something else. And I wonder if the earth has always been thinner than we believed. If the spaces we open for our dead have always had the potential to become doorways, waiting to reveal what lies beneath. I'll never know the answer, but I'll also never forget standing at the edge of that excavation and watching a rock fall forever into darkness that shouldn't exist. Some things don't have explanations. Some expertise means nothing when you're faced with something truly impossible. And some graves don't hold the dead at all. They release them into something beyond our understanding. That's what keeps me awake now. Not the graves I know about, the ones I don't know about. The countless excavations from decades past that might be hiding the same secret beneath the peaceful surface of cemeteries everywhere. We trust the ground to hold our dead. But what if sometimes, in ways we can't predict or understand, it lets them fall through into forever instead? I used to think I knew the earth. Now I know I never did. And that's a terrible thing to realize after spending your entire adult life working in it.